Hi again, my name is Greg and welcome to Chapter 8 of my 1949 P3 Rover restoration story. In this chapter I'm going to detail some of the work that I've did on the battery box on my car. The P3 Rover battery is contained within a steel box, and that steel box is situated underneath the back seat of the car, which I think probably wasn't unusual practice back in the day. The drawback with having the box under the car, more or less underneath the car, is that it is fairly subject to getting rusted out, and that's exactly what happened to mine. So in this chapter I'll detail the work that I did in removing the old battery box, and I guess my initial plan was just to repair it, but in the end I more or less made a new box, and then I'll also detail how I went about fitting the new box back to the car. To begin with, I'll just show you exactly where the box is, so you know what I'm talking about. I hope you enjoy it. Well, the task today is to remove the battery box. So I've removed the back seat, that's all out, and the battery sits underneath the back seat, so you've got that cover there that covers the battery box. The reason I want to remove the battery box is it's actually quite rusted out. So I want to drill out the spot welds that are holding it in, remove it, and then basically repair it really.
This is just a shot of my P3 Rover, taken quite some time ago now. At the moment the car's in many more pieces, but I've just included this shot just in case you don't know what a P3 Rover looks like. Well, it looks like this. I'm just starting to remove the old battery box now. So I had to remove this little bracket. This bracket retains sort of one edge of the cover of the battery box, but I had to remove that first in order to get to the spot welds that hold the actual battery box in. I'm drilling out the spot welds that hold the battery box in now. I use an angle die grinder, which to be honest wasn't the most ideal tool, but it's the only tool I had where I could actually drill in such a confined space. Is that the trouble I had with it is it runs too fast really, and so I had to be very careful to try and keep the speed down. I'm using a special drill bit which is designed especially for drilling out spot welds. Here's the battery box removed from the car now. In addition to drilling out the spot welds, I did have to do a little bit of work with a chisel to get it out. Managed not to do too much damage in the end. As you can see, it's pretty rusted out. It's a combination of two things really. I think the location, because it's under the car, it gets wet and it gets covered in mud and that sort of thing. But also, I think the fumes from the battery don't help as well. My initial plan was just to cut out the rusted bits of the panels and then sort of patch some new bits of steel in, but in the end I decided the only thing I could really salvage from the whole box were the heavy steel straps that ran underneath it. So at this point I've drilled out all the spot welds that are holding it together and reduced it to sort of separate panels. Today I'm working on the battery box on my car. This is part of the battery box that I've removed from the car. It's got two ends like so, and two sides like so. As you can see, it's pretty rusted out, so I'm going to make basically a whole new box. I've had a go at doing one of the ends, forming this sort of stiffening profile. So I'm just going to do a short video as I make the other end. This is a technique that I found from a YouTube video actually. it might be about as good as I'm going to get it. I've got it, as far as I can see, to the same depth as my first one, and yeah, it's probably going to par. This one maybe looks a little rougher, but I think I can smooth it out after I get it off of here. So I'll unclamp it, see what it looks like. It's actually not bad, I reckon. I've described where I want it to go. What I'll do now is I'll just get some panel beating hammers and just sort of flatten it out around the edge, and it will be good enough, given that it's a battery box that sits underneath the car. I'm going to cover it in paint. This photo is a bit out of sequence really, but it just shows the end plate that I was making in the last bit of video. At this stage it's actually a little bit further progressed and actually well welded into the box. Here are the plywood formers that I cut to help with making the shape and form of the steel panels on the battery box. This is the former that I made for the two end panels, where I had just a simple shape to form. Just needed the one piece of ply for that, and the steel was then clamped on top of that, and basically used hammers to then sort of beat the shape. The side panels were a little more complicated in that I had to cut two formers. I'd cut one for the bottom, place the sheet of steel on top of that, and then a second plywood former on top of that, and that was all clamped down very firmly. And then I used a pneumatic or an air hammer to assist in making the bead form. Now, just to explain what I'm doing, I've clamped the steel between two plywood formers, and I'm using an air chisel. The tool on the air chisel, I've rounded it off to I think from memory it was about a 10mm radius or thereabouts. I had to experiment a bit to get it to do the sort of form that I wanted, but in the end I found the best technique was to hold the chisel at a bit of an angle, use a fair bit of pressure, and then you ended up more or less sort of rolling the form into the steel quite nicely. I had to pause the work fairly frequently due to the fact that I had to allow the air compressor to catch up. I've got a pretty good air compressor, but the problem is this air chisel does use quite a lot of air. Well, here it is. I reckon that'll be good enough actually. It's not perfect, but I can basically do a bit of beating it with the panel hammers just to sort of improve it a little bit. The next stage of the process was to cut out the long elongated holes in the side panels. For this I drilled a hole in the sheets and then threaded the bandsaw blade through it. And then I had to butt weld the bandsaw blade back together again, which I'll show you in some other shots. My bandsaw is equipped such that you can actually make your own blades, and here I am. After I've explained earlier on, I've threaded the blade through the piece of work, and now I'm butt welding the blade together. The next part of the process is to then just grind off the sort of weld flash off of both sides of the blade. Almost there now with the elongated hole. With the bandsaw, I just roughed out as best I could, and then I finished off the radius at each end just with a hand file. Here I'm using the first sheet that I cut to help me mark out the second sheet. However, a thing to remember is that the sheets need to be a mirror image of each other. Just doing the sort of final finishing with the file. Here I'm just using a cheap sheet metal bender that I bought. This particular version you can just clamp in your vise, your bench vise, so it's pretty handy really. The top half inch of each end panel is bent over, and it's that bent over bit that then gets welded into the car. In the next section of video I'll show some of the welding that I did. I used a process called plug welding, which I'll explain a little bit in the video anyway. I salvaged the heavy steel straps from the original battery box, so the two bent steel straps that you can see that I'm starting to attach the sheet metal to in this bit of video. Now I used a process called plug welding, where I drilled little 6mm diameter holes in the sheet steel at the points where I wanted to do a weld. And it's just really a substitute for the original spot welds. I don't have a spot welder, so it's just a different way of doing it really. My welder settings weren't quite 100% correct during this sequence. I should have had the wire feed on my MIG welder just running a little bit faster, and that would have produced a slightly better weld. When the settings are correct, you tend to get a sound that sounds a lot like sizzling bacon, whereas mine sounded a little bit more spluttery. At this stage I'm just continuing with the plug welds, so what I do is I do a plug weld, and then I clamp the sheet steel to the heavy steel strap a little further along, do another plug weld, and so on and so forth, so that you get a nice neat join between the sheet steel and the heavy steel strap with no gap. Finished welding the end plates on now, so the next part of the job is to weld the side plates on. I had to do a slight change from the original design in that the sheets of steel that I had for the side plates weren't quite big enough to allow me to just do a little fold on either side. So I had to make little right angle brackets, which you'll see in the next shot. And here's one of the side plates, fairly well progressed in terms of getting it welded on, and you can see that I've used that plug welding process again, and you can see the little right angle brackets that I've made on either corner. This shot just shows the next stage in the process where the excess weld in my plug welds, I've just ground them off flat. So in a lot of ways it then looks very similar to the original, which was spot welded. Pretty much the finished box now. You can see on the upper edge of the box here, there's little holes drilled through. Those little holes that allow me to plug weld the box in situ in the car. This shot shows the cover plate that sits on top of the battery box. Again, I had a bit of a problem with rust. You can see two sort of brackets in this shot. One is the sort of beginning stages of a replacement that I made, and the other is the sort of rusted out version that I'm replacing. There was a bracket at either end of this cover plate, and screwed into the bracket is a rubber buffer that sort of holds the battery down and in position. Well, here we are in the back of the car. This is the spot where the battery box will go back in. I've got to do some work. I've got to basically tidy up the area where this battery box will go back and do a little bit of welding repair. I did a little bit of damage when I removed the box, but that was pretty much unavoidable. I removed the fuel tank, so what I'm going to have to do is cut out some damaged bits of steel and then weld in some patch bits of steel, and there's also a little hole there to patch up, and then just get everything back to bare metal. Okay, today I'm going to do some repair on the area where the battery box sits. I've cut a patch which will fit in there. Oops, dropped it. Another patch which will go on the end here, and another patch for that corner as well. So yep, we'll get on and do the welding. So here's the first patch. I've held it in place with a welding magnet, which will just hold that patch flush against the piece of steel that I want to weld it into. Okay, I've done the welding now. That's one of the tabs I welded in at the back. I'll just focus in on that. Not a fantastic job, but be good enough. Probably a bit of a better job on that side where I've blended in the weld quite nicely afterwards, and that's the third patch just there, which worked out quite well. Also, also fixed up, well, it's not focusing now, the hole that was about there. Well, here's the moment I've been working towards for a while. I've got the painted battery box in situ now, and I'm going to work on welding it in. So I've drilled out holes in various places where I'll do plug welds, and I've prepped the surfaces where the welds will happen with the product called Weld through primer. This shows the new battery box back in place. I've obviously finished all the welding, and it's all painted up now. I also stripped back all the surrounding area, which was looking pretty disgusting, really, and I've painted that in the same rust-proofing paint that I've used on the battery box. Quite happy with the end result. I mean, I admit it's not perfect. Normally, if you're doing something like this on a sort of one-off basis, you would use a machine called a bead roller to sort of do those forms in the side panels. But it just wasn't worth my while getting that sort of set up just to do the one job like this. This will be the last shot for this chapter. I hope you've enjoyed it. I did actually a couple of other things as well, which aren't that well shown in these shots. I made up a new earth strap and also cut a piece of rubber to line the bottom of the box, which I think is how they were originally. For my next chapter, I may cover probably the suspension and steering. That's the job that I've been working on most recently. So yeah, stay tuned.